All right, well, hello there, and welcome to our Lesson 5 lecture. So far, I've just really been reviewing the work that you guys have done so far in the course, and I'm thoroughly impressed, and I thank you so much for your efforts and your determination towards your success. I know that you're going to continue to do great for the rest of the term, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the material for this lesson. Okay, so how will this apply to me? Well, you may not consider yourself a public speaker, but most of our careers in any field that we go into will involve knowing how, or better yet, having the skills to clearly and effectively communicate information to other people. So in lesson 5, we're actually going to be going over informative speaking. We're going to go ahead and start talking about persuasive speaking, and that is a speech you're going to do in the next lesson. But in this lesson, you're actually going to be creating and delivering an informative speech. So with that in mind, I always think it's important for students to understand why we do informative speaking, why we go over this. Well, like I said, in any career you go into, you're going to have to know how to clearly and effectively communicate information to other people. Now, other people might be your colleagues, it might be your supervisors or superiors, it might be your clients, or it could just be, people that you communicate with on a daily basis. And with that in mind, we need to think about that in personal terms as well. Our personal lives, we use informative speaking a great deal. So with that being said, we need to make sure that we understand not only just how to use informative speaking skills, but how to use them effectively. So informative speaking occurs in a wide range of everyday situations. Let's say that you are an architect. Well, architects reviews and communicates plans for a new building to someone else. That's informative speaking. Supervisor informs employees of a new process. That's informative speaking as well. Let's say that you're a church volunteer and you're outlining plans for a funds drive. That's going to be informative speaking. As long as you're not persuading them why someone should donate money, if you're just informing other volunteers or people associated with the project of how you plan on raising funds for something, that's going to be informative speaking. So these situations are endless in real life, and we use informative speaking on a daily basis. So other situations which you might use informative speaking could be if you're giving a report on something, let's say a business situation, or even in another class, you might have to give a report on something. Well, that's going to be informative speaking. Providing instructions on how to do something, how to make something, a process of some sort, that's going to be informative speaking as well. Demonstrating techniques and products. Well, you've already actually done this, and that's going to be in your demonstration speeches. So when we demonstrate something, that actually falls into the category of informative speaking as well. Although, keep in mind on this speech, on our informative speech in this lesson, I don't want you to do a demonstration speech because we've already done those. I want you to focus more of the informative speaking in terms of relaying information and teaching us about something and so forth. So I'm going to give you some great examples later on though. If you're updating people on current events, you're doing an informative speech of some sort or using informative communication skills. And just giving general information about a topic is going to, again, fall under informative speaking. So if you really start thinking about this, take a day out of your life and just kind of think about informative speaking. Think about all the times that you've used informative speaking in a day. It's probably more than you realize. So with that in mind, we want to really hone in and perfect those skills because it's something that we use so often. So competence in this form of communication will prove to be very valuable to you throughout your life. Okay, in our informative speaking assignment, think in terms of teaching others some form of information. So you're not going to be demonstrating in this speech because again, like I said, we've already done demonstration speeches, so I want you to do a different kind of informative speech. So think about, informing people of, the process of voting. Just don't persuade them to become registered voters because that is, where informative speaking actually crosses into persuasive speaking. So informing them about something, I've had people before inform each other on rare diseases, syndromes, things like that. I've had them give information on, gosh, I've had them give information on so many different things. So it could be anything that you are teaching us that you aren't necessarily demonstrating. Okay, so you kind of think in those terms. But I've had a lot of different informative speeches over time. I've had informative speeches on, you know, different forms of wildlife. I've had informative speeches on places to travel. Again, just don't persuade us on that's why we should travel here. I've had informative speeches on, oh gosh, goodness, it's just so much different programs and policies and, you know, like I said, diseases and things like that. I've had informative speeches on the benefits of exercising on a daily basis. I've had, you know, just so many different things there. So think about it as a speech to teach, just not, you're actually not going to be demonstrating in this speech. So your aim, though, is to convey knowledge and understanding, not to advocate a cause. So the difference there would be, you know, I can inform you or teach you about how to become an organ donor. But when I'm advocating for you to become an organ donor by saying you need to do this, it's so important, you know, you can save tons of lives with this and so forth, that's when I actually cross over that line and become an advocate for that cause. So if you were going to advocate for or against something, would this be an informative speech? Well, I just answered my own question there. No, that's going to be a persuasive speech. So your aim in an informative speech is actually just to convey knowledge and understanding, not to persuade someone on something. Make sure when you're informing others to be accurate and to be clear with the information that you're communicating. Accuracy and clarity are so much more vital than a lot of people realize, because when we're accurate and we're clear with our information, not only do we convey credibility there, and we're also, you know, being a responsible speaker, but also we're just, you know, making sure that people are really understanding our message, and that is so important to informative speaking. So there are various types of informative speeches. Now, an informative speech by definition is a speech designed to convey knowledge and understanding. So when you're thinking about informative speech topics, think about that. Is that topic that I came up with, is it going to convey knowledge and understanding? Just something to keep in mind there. There are a few ways to classify informative speeches. Now, I just have the most common here. Of course, there's more than this, so this is not a be-all, end-all list here, but the most common forms of informative speeches are going to be speeches about objects, speeches about processes, speeches about events, and speeches about concepts. Now, a speech about objects is going to be, you know, an object is going to be defined here as anything that is visible, tangible, and stable in form. And I'm actually going to go over these in just a minute a lot further. A speech about processes. A process is going to be defined here as a systematic series of actions that leads to a specific result or product. Speeches about events. An event here would be defined as anything that happens or is regarded as happening. And then speeches about concepts. A concept here is going to be defined as a belief, theory, idea, notion, principle, or the like. But let's take a look at each of these just a bit further. Speeches about objects is going to be, like I said, one type of informative speech. So objects are going to include anything that's visible, tangible, and stable in form. So they might have moving parts or be alive. They could include places, structures, animals, and even people for that matter. Examples of informative speeches that are going to address speeches about objects could be an informative speech that discusses service dogs, Legos, you know, dream catchers, Albert Einstein, gorillas. I'm going to go into this a lot further so you understand it a little bit better, but this would be examples of an informative speech that is a speech about objects. So you will not have time to tell your classmates everything about any of these subjects that I just listed. So what I want you to do is choose a specific purpose statement which focuses on one aspect of that subject. And here's an example here, because I think examples really help us to learn. A specific purpose statement for service dogs might be to inform my audience about 3 major kinds of service dogs. Well, in a speech that has the time limits in which we have in this course, you could pretty well discuss 3 major kinds of service dogs in that amount of time. So that would be a great specific purpose statement which really focuses on one aspect of service dogs. Now notice how precise these specific purpose statements are though. So let's look at a different example here. If I were to say my specific purpose statement was to inform my audience about Frida Kahlo, is that specific enough? Is it precise enough? Well, no, because there's a lot of elements that went into this very famous artist. But a better specific purpose statement here might be to inform my audience about the major contributions of Frida Kahlo to modern art. So you see how that's just a bit more precise there and really hones in on what you're going to be discussing in this speech. Because if you're going to talk about Frida Kahlo as a whole, then you would need to talk about, Frida Kahlo as a whole. You would want to talk about, you know, everything from when she was born to when she died. I mean, you would have to discuss all that. So it's just not precise enough for the amount of time we have in there. So really look at designing specific purpose statements that hone in on exactly what you want to cover in your speech. And it's going to help you to better build that speech as well. So speeches about objects, though, just so you know, they usually use a chronological order or even a spatial order, just because the nature of the speech. Okay. And I want you on that note to remember this. Like I've said millions and millions of times before, organization is key to any speech that you create. So do you remember discussing the various types of organizational patterns used in speech design? Because I actually went over that in a past lecture recording as well. Well, just in case you don't remember, there are 5 basic patterns of organization that are used most often by public speakers. And that 5 basic patterns of organization is going to be chronological order, spatial order, causal order, problem solution order, and topical order. And just kind of a refresher here, but chronological order is going to be a method of speech organization in which the main points follow a time pattern of some sort. Spatial order is going to be a method of speech organization in which the main points follow a directional pattern. Causal order is a method of speech organization in which the main points show a cause-effect relationship. Problem solution order is a method of speech organization in which the first main point deals with the existence of a problem and the second main point presents a solution to that problem. And then there's topical order. And topical order is a method of speech organization in which the main points divide the topic into logical and consistent subtopics. So in informative speaking, you will either use generally chronological order, spatial order, or topical order. So like I said, chronological, spatial, or topical order. Generally, causal order and problem solution order are going to be used in persuasive speaking. So just something to keep in mind for our next set of, or actually our next speech in lesson 6. So, but for right now, this will give you just kind of a refresher on what we already covered. But if you want to learn more about the chronological, spatial, causal, problem solution, and topical order, go back to our lesson 3 live lecture recording, because that's going to be where I actually go into each one of those patterns of organization in depth, and I give you great examples to help you better understand those things. So, okay, we will move on though. So we have already talked about speeches about objects, and we talked about how those speeches about objects usually use a chronological or a spatial order. Now, speeches about processes, which is a different kind of informative speech, is a basically a speech about something that follows a process. So a process here is defined as a systematic series of actions that leads to a specific result or product. Speeches about processes explain how something is made, how something is done, or even how something works. So have you ever performed a speech about a process? Really think about this. Have you ever performed a speech about a process? Well, that's actually a trick question, right? We've all done a speech about a process, how we've explained how something's made, how something's done, or how something works, because you've done demonstration speeches already in this course. And in a demonstration speech, you're showing us how either something is made, how something is done, or how it works. So you've already done this type of speech. Now, a few examples here, though, of a good specific purpose statement for a speech about a process. Okay, yeah, so here are some examples of good specific purpose statements for speeches about a process. So an example here might be to inform my audience how flash floods develop. So we're talking about a process of how a flash flood would develop. To inform my audience on how to change a tire. Well, you're going to go through the actual process of how to change a tire. Again, though, not for this speech because process speeches were in demonstration speeches. But just so you know, this is an informative speech. The demonstration speeches you already have done in the course were an informative speech. So to inform my audience on how U.S. currency is made, that's going to be a process. So speeches about processes may require visual aids, and that's why in demonstration speeches we actually had you demonstrate how to do this thing, how to make it, how it works, whatever it was, because visual aids can be, so helpful in a speech about a process. But they also usually follow a chronological pattern of organization or either a topical pattern of organization. Now, speeches about events. An event here is going to be defined as anything that happens or is regarded as happening. So an example of a topic for this type of informative speech might be a topic or a speech about Boston Marathon, sleep deprivation, the Daniel fast, cyber terrorism, or even therapeutic massage. So that's going to be a form of event of some sorts. So, and again, the therapeutic massage one, because I know you're wondering, well, isn't that a process? Well, again, it's all in how you approach the speech. But here are some examples of good specific purpose statements for speeches about an event. So to inform my audience about the major types of therapeutic massage, again, you're not talking about a process here. You're talking about the actual event of it. That's something that's happened or is regarded as happening. So to inform our audience about the major types of therapeutic massage would be a good example of a specific purpose for a speech about an event, or to inform my audience about what occurs during the Daniel fast, or another example would be to inform my audience about 3 aspects of the Mardi Gras celebration in Mobile, Alabama. So that would be another good example of a specific purpose statement for speeches about an event. So speeches about events often use the chronological or topical patterns of organization as well. And then we have speeches about concepts. And a concept here is going to be defined as a belief, a theory, an idea, a notion, a principle, or such. These speeches are actually more abstract than the object speeches or process speeches or even the event speeches. Some example topics for this style of speech might be philosophies of education. Well, that's going to be a very abstract way of looking at a speech topic because there are a lot of philosophies about education. Sustainability would be another example. Original intent doctrine or even Confucianism. So these would be great example topics for a speech about a concept. And here are some good examples of specific purpose statements for speeches about concepts. To inform my audience about the philosophy or net neutrality. To inform my audience about the doctrine of original intent or constitutional interpretation. Or to inform my audience about the basic principles of Confucianism. So that would be some great examples of specific purpose statements for speeches about concepts. And again, speeches about concepts usually follow the topical organizational pattern. Okay, so guidelines for informative speaking. I wanted to discuss a few guidelines for informative speaking before we actually do informative speeches because I think it'll really help you. First off, don't overestimate what the audience knows. Well, why is this important? Well, the more you assume that your audience knows about your speech topic, the greater are your chances of being misunderstood on some level. Because speech audiences consist of a lot of different types of listener. It could be someone who is well informed on your speech, someone who might only know a little bit about your speech, someone that only knows the basic knowledge or has barely heard of your speech topic, but it sounds familiar. And then you've got people that are totally misunderstanding it, or people that have no knowledge at all about this. So what you want to do is you never want to overestimate what your audience knows. Always start from the beginning is what I say. Lay a good foundation and build from there. You also want to relate the subject directly to your audience. That's a great guideline right there. An example might be, here's a don't do this. You don't want to start off your speech with, I want to talk with you about the Ironman competition. Well, why wouldn't you start a speech off with that? Well, it's boring for one, and for another, I don't feel like as a listener I'm able to relate to you on this. So I'm probably going to lose interest very quickly. But you might want to start off this way. This would be a really good example of a great attention getter that helps the topic be directly related to the audience in some way. Okay, your body can't go any further. Your toenails fell off long ago. Your lungs are on fire. Your heart is one beat away from exploding. Are you dying? Are you dreaming? Neither. You're about to cross the finish line of your very first Ironman competition, and nothing could feel better. So you see how that is just a lot more relatable. It's a lot more inclusive. It's a lot more interesting attention getter than the first one that I mentioned there. So just something to keep in mind. Another thing is don't be too technical in informative speeches. I know a lot of times we do speeches about things that have, that are highly technical in nature. So you want to make sure that you aren't being too technical with your language, because you want to assume, especially in this course and in most things that you do, you want to assume that you're giving information to a group of people that, again, don't overestimate what they know, right? That doesn't have a lot of experience with what you're talking about or isn't too familiar with it. You always want to start and lay a good foundation. Now, if you're at a technical style conference, then of course you're going to want to be a little bit more advanced with things. But for the most part, in most situations, you don't want to be too technical. So here is a don't for an attention getter. Okay. Graphene is a two-dimensional material composed of a single layer of carbon atoms. The structure of graphene is a hexagonal lattice of 0.33 nanometer thickness. A semi-metal or zero-gap semiconductor, graphene allows electrons to flow through it at 1/100th the speed of light, as if they carried no mass. Okay, that's pretty technical, right? So you want to avoid that. Now, you might want to approach it in this manner, though, and this one is definitely not too technical in nature. It's the strongest, thickest, most conductive material in the world. The New York Times calls it the material of tomorrow, but you can call it by its official name, graphene. Nick Bilton, technology writer for the Times, explains graphene's miraculous properties. 1,000,000 times thinner than a single hair on your head, it is 200 times stronger than steel and can conduct electricity faster than anything known to exist. It is also bendable and can be stretched by up to 20% of its original length. Cell phones made of graphene will be the width of a piece of paper. Airplanes made of it will be lighter, stronger, and faster. In these ways, and countless others, graphene will transform our lives in the years to come. So you see how the second one there that I just did was, it's a lot more interesting. It's definitely not too technical in nature. It uses a lot of analogies, so we can really, even if we're not familiar with how thin this material would be, we do know that a single hair on your head is pretty thin. So if it's 1,000,000 times thinner than a single hair on your head, wow, that's really thin. So we're able to better understand that from a point of view of someone who's not familiar with the material as a whole. Also, something else I want to point your attention to here is, where I said the New York Times calls it the material of tomorrow? That is how we verbally cite material in a speech. So you just don't want to just say, it's the material of tomorrow. Well, that's not your idea. That came from the New York Times. So if we were to do that, that would actually be, stealing intellectual property there. It would be called plagiarism, basically. So what we want to do is we want to give credit where credit's due, and we want to say the New York Times calls it the material of tomorrow. And not only does it help us to avoid plagiarism, but also it just lends more credibility to what we're saying, because we are stating where we got this great information from. So just kind of something to keep in mind there. So don't be too technical with your information. You also want to avoid abstractions. You can do this by a lot of different ways. The first one I want to talk about is using vivid language. So a good example of how we could use vivid language to avoid abstractions might be this. As we wait for the plane as we wait for the plane to climb to the jump altitude of 12,000 feet, my mind races with a frenzied jumble of thoughts. Okay, this is the moment you've been waiting for. It's going to be great. Am I really going to jump out of an airplane from 12,000 feet? What what if something goes wrong? Can I still back out? Come on now, don't worry, it'll be fine. Now it's time to jump. My palms are sweating and my heart is pounding so hard I think it may burst. Get ready, yells the instructor. As I jump into the blue, I wonder, what am I doing here? The blast of air resistance blows me backwards like a leaf at the mercy of an autumn wind. In about 10 seconds, my body levels out and accelerates to a speed of 120 miles an hour. The air supports my body like an invisible flying carpet. There's no sound except for the wind rushing around my face. Any fears or doubts I had are gone in the exhilaration of the free flight. Every nerve in my body is alive with sensation, yet I'm overcome by a peaceful feeling and the sense that I am at one with the sky. So you see there how I avoided abstractions by using that vivid language. I really made you feel like you were a part of this. I really made you see what was going on from my point of view. Vivid language is a great way to really get the excitement going about your speech topic and really help the listener feel like they're a part of it. Using comparisons is another way. And here's a good example of how you use comparisons. If a comet or large asteroid struck the Earth, the impact would be devastating. To give you an idea how devastating the impact would be, it would be like all the nuclear bombs in the world going off at one spot. Do you see how I compared that? So it gives a clear idea of if a comet or a large asteroid struck the Earth, it gives you a clear idea of what that devastation would be. So it's a good comparison there. And also, we can avoid abstractions by using contrast. And here's an example of how we can use contrast. Last year, Americans spent $15 billion playing fantasy football. In contrast, the total revenue for the National Football League was only $10 billion. Think about it. Americans spend $5 billion more on NFL fantasy football than they do the real thing. So you see how we contrasted two things there. We contrasted fantasy football along with just the NFL as a whole. So just another way to avoid abstractions there. All right, so another guideline for informative speaking is to personalize your ideas. Listeners want to be entertained as they're being enlightened on something. So I'm not saying, be a comedian. Definitely not. So I want you to understand what I mean by entertained there. I mean, when we use things like we use contrast and we use vivid language and we use comparisons for things and we're not too technical and we find ways to relate that speech to the audience and we don't overestimate what they know, then we are finding ways to personalize our ideas. Another great way to really personalize your ideas is the use of narratives. And again, kind of going over what I've talked about so far, when we create a narrative for our listeners, first of all, we want to make sure that that narrative has a clear goal in mind. We're not just telling a story. We need to find out why we're going to use this narrative. What's the point there? And when we develop narratives, we want to really develop them as a whole. So develop what the plot is, who is involved and so forth. Really use vivid language to paint pictures of things for us. And that's a great way to personalize your ideas. So narratives can be a great way to connect the facts and figures to something that's more meaningful. So we might say, the statistics on the homeless population, statistics are very strong as far as informative and persuasive speaking goes. Statistics can go a long way because they are highly reliable in most situations and they hold a lot of credibility. But we can't just use statistics and facts alone. We want to try to tie in narratives as well because narratives really drive our points home. So we can use statistics on the homeless population, but we also want to tell a narrative of some kind about a homeless family struggle perhaps. And that just kind of helps to solidify the facts and the figures with something that's a bit more meaningful as well. Another guideline for informative speaking is be creative. So if you think creatively when you construct your informative speeches, you're more likely to be successful. And, kind of going back over what we've talked about so far as the guidelines for informative speaking goes, if you're following those things, you are being creative. So just something to keep in mind there. Okay, so in a typical day, I want you to think about your day. Maybe it's today or maybe it's yesterday if your day is just starting. What have you done today? Or what did you do yesterday? Well, if I asked each one of you this in a classroom in which we were actually all sitting and present in, if I asked you to describe your day to me, you might say something along the lines of, well, I talked to my literature professor about an extension on an assignment. I worked a while at my job making sales calls. I received a few quotes to discuss options about something which needs to be repaired on my car. And I also convinced my significant other to watch my favorite television show tonight instead of something else that he normally watches. Now, you might not realize this, but all of those things I just discussed, are going to be persuasive speaking. Many of us spend a large part of our day persuading others, persuading people to do things they were reluctant to do, or just to try different things, or, whatever it might be. We spend a lot of time persuading. So if we look back at that, if you were talking to your literature professor about an extension on an assignment, you were persuading that person to give you an extension. If you are working at a job making sales calls, you were persuading people to buy your products. If you receive quotes and discuss options about something that needs to be repaired on your car, chances are you're persuading that person to meet you in the middle somewhere on price, and persuading them to give you a few options on the different things as well as far as repairs go. If you're convincing someone to watch your television show at night, you're persuading them on why they should watch your show over the show they normally watch. All of that's persuasive speaking. And that's why I want to go ahead and start talking about persuasive speaking. In your next lesson, you're going to be delivering persuasive speeches, but I want to go ahead and start talking about it now because it'll kind of give you a foundation to start thinking about your persuasive speech topics, and also to start designing those speeches as well if you want to work ahead a little bit. So persuasion. Most times when we speak, we try to influence how other people see things, how they feel, how they believe, how they act, and just so much more. So we use persuasion a lot more than you might think as well. Now, we might not always succeed when we try to persuade other people, and nor should we always succeed. If you always were right, then that wouldn't be a good thing, right? Some of you are going, well, yes, it would be a wonderful thing. Well, no, of course not. Other people may be more persuasive than you. They may be more informed than you, and so forth. So it's okay if other people are just a little bit better at this, but we want to make sure that our persuasive speaking skills are up to par, because we do use this a lot as well, just like our informative speeches. So depending on the listener, the situation, the merits of the case, and so forth, it all just depends on how successful you're going to be. But at least we have the opportunity to have our ideas heard when we do persuasion. Persuasion is the process of creating, reinforcing, or even changing people's beliefs or actions. So we use this a lot, actually. The importance of persuasion. Now, the ability to speak and write persuasively will benefit you in every part of your life. And it might benefit you anywhere from personal relationships to community activities to even career aspirations. Persuasion speaking is all around us. When we persuade people, we're acting as an advocate for something. Your job in persuasive speaking is to get listeners to agree with you and perhaps even to act on that belief in some way. What I want you to keep in mind is, I want you to keep in mind and really think about persuasion speech as kind of a mental dialogue with your audience. Think about what they're going to be thinking, what they're going to be feeling, and so forth. One tip I want to give you is, if you're giving a persuasion speech on something in which there might be a lot of myths about that topic, don't pretend that that doesn't exist. My best suggestion on that is to talk about the myths in your speech and talk about, why that myth is a myth. Why is it just a myth? And I want to give you an example on that. I've had students before do persuasion speeches on organ donation, why someone should become an organ donor. Now, with that in mind, I'm not sure if you know this or not, but there's a lot of myths out there about organ donation. I've heard them all. I've heard people say that you shouldn't become an organ donor because the doctors aren't as likely to save your life. If they see you're an organ donor, they'll just, go ahead and let you perish, and that way they can save tons of other people's lives with your organs. Okay, I've heard that myth. I've also heard things such as, you might not be fully, you might not be dead, and they go to harvest your organs for organ donations. Now, I know some of you right now are kind of giggling thinking about all these myths out there, but there are probably a few people that have heard some of these myths. And while you may think that, yeah, this isn't logical, something still keeps you from being an organ donor. And it's going to be the myths that are out there. It's going to be that fear that you have inside. So on these types of speeches, I always say that if there's myths about something, don't just talk about the benefits of organ donation and leave it at that. You also want to, at some point in your speech, talk about the myths, talk about why, this couldn't possibly happen, and then kind of, and also, so with that being said, this is why I think you should become an organ donor kind of deal. Because if you just pretend that it's not there, at the end of your speech, people are going to go, yeah, I think it's wonderful that people are organ donors, but on the same fact, I don't know, I'm still a little bit scared about this. So we can't pretend that the boogeyman's not in the closet. Okay, we got to bring it out. We got to talk about it. Don't be condescending when you do it, but you want to talk about why this couldn't be possible. You could talk about how doctors take an oath to do everything they can to save your life. So, they're not going to just let you die. You want to talk about how, you want to possibly gather research on how actually people who are organ donors go through a much deeper process of making sure that person has passed away because they're doing different tests and so forth to prepare you for organ donation. So you're more likely to not be, for people not to realize that you haven't passed away if you're not an organ donor. So, these are things you want to talk about in your speech. You want to gather research and you want to talk about why this myth couldn't possibly be true. Okay. But like I said, think of persuasion speaking as a kind of mental dialogue with the audience. Think about what they're thinking. Think in terms of the ways that might hinder them from being persuaded. So just something to keep in mind there. Moving listeners from being strongly opposed to a speaker's position to being only moderately opposed could be a sign of a successful persuasive speech. We generally don't change the minds of other people in persuasive speaking in the limited amount of time that we have. Usually that occurs over some long duration of time. But what I always try to tell my students is what we're looking to do is plant a seed of change. So just get them thinking about it. If someone came into that classroom and they were adamantly against being an organ donor and you just made them think for just a second about how it might be such a wonderful thing to be an organ donor and how that, in my eyes, is actually the most ultimate last gift that you can give anyone. If you can get them thinking in those terms, then in my opinion, and also in your textbook's opinion, that would be a sign of a successful persuasive speech because you got them to not only just to not be strongly opposed to it, but just moderately opposed. And I think when we do that, it allows them to think about the information over the next couple of days, weeks, months, years for that matter, whatever it might be. And you might actually move them to change one day based on the information that you gave them. Okay, so because persuasive speakers must communicate information clearly and concisely, just like our informative speeches, you will need all of the skills from how we learned how to speak to inform, but also you're going to be adding new skills as well, which is going to take you from just giving information to actually affecting your listeners' attitudes, beliefs, or actions. So that's what we do in informative speeches first, because we learn those skills, and then we take those skills into persuasion speaking, and we build on those skills to make them even greater, even better, even, more successful in persuasion. So why do we speak persuasively? Well, speaking out on public issues is important, but a lot of times people still ask, what difference can one person make? I hear this a lot, especially when it comes to, let's say, voting. I'll hear someone say, I don't understand, I think voting is important, but at the same time, what difference can I make? What difference can one vote make? What can make a world of difference? In my opinion, you may not think you're making a lot of difference, but words, as far as persuasion speaking goes, words can make ripples, and ripples can come together to make big waves. So while you don't think that your speeches are going to have a lot of impact beyond your audience, this class or whatever, you never know who or what may make a change because of it. Just something to keep in mind. And remember, when trying to persuade listeners to take action, you should usually be really specific about the action you want them to take. So at the end of that organ donation speech, you'd actually want to not only discuss how to become an organ donor, but also really give them a call to action to do that. You know, this, I think you should become an organ donor. It's the ultimate last gift that you can give. So tell them what you want them to do. Again, don't be condescending. Don't be too bossy, but you need to be specific about the action you want them to take. Okay. The nature of persuasive speaking. Persuasive speaking differs from informative speaking in about 8 basic ways. First, informative speeches reveal options, so they give you options for different things. But persuasive speeches actually urge a choice among those options. So informative speakers expand our awareness on something because they're teaching us about something, but persuasive speakers push us towards a choice of some sort. And here's an example. There are 3 different ways we can make the economy better. Let me explain. This allows the speaker to evaluate these options, but generally urges them to support one of these 3 options. Second, informative speakers act as teachers, but persuasive speakers act as advocates for something. Persuasive speakers should be committed to a cause. So you've got to have a passion for this. You've got to really be committed to it because the audience is going to be able to see these things. You need to be that advocate in persuasive speaking. Third, informative speeches offer supporting material to illustrate points, but persuasive speeches use that supporting material to provide evidence that justifies something. So an ethical persuader uses facts, statistics, testimony, examples, and narratives to really make a compelling case based on responsible knowledge and sensitivity to the best interests of the listener. So we use supporting material as evidence to justify something. Fourth, the role of the audience changes dramatically from information to persuasion. So informed listeners expand their knowledge. When we're doing informative speaking, we're expanding knowledge. But persuasion, when we persuade listeners, we become an agent of change. For our listeners, we're hoping to develop new attitudes, new beliefs, and actions that will affect them and also carry on to other people. If you're able to change someone's mind on something or just plant a seed of change, chances are that person's going to go home and really think about what you've said and possibly convey that information to somebody else. So we're seeking to not only affect the attitudes, beliefs, and actions of one person out in the crowd of our listeners, but also have them to affect other people as well. Fifth, persuasive speeches ask more audience commitment than informative speeches do. So although there's some risk to being exposed to new ideas and such, more is at stake when we listen to a persuasive message. And that's because we're actually asking people to reevaluate their attitudes, beliefs, or actions on something. So persuasive speeches can be a little more touchy in nature, and they definitely ask a lot more audience commitment than an informative speech would. Sixth, leadership is even more important in a persuasive speech than in an informative speech. And that's because you have to be a leader. You have to be the advocate in a persuasive speech. Whereas in an informative speech, you're just a teacher. And you can teach it, here's the information, take it or leave it, not a big deal. But in persuasive speeches, we're acting as an advocate. We're asking the audience to make a change of some sort. So because persuasive speeches involve risk, listeners weigh the character and competence of speakers very closely. Seventh, appeals to feeling are more useful in persuasive speaking than in informative speeches. Because when we appeal to people's feelings, and we'll talk about what that is in just a second, we are really playing on their emotions, not in an irresponsible way, but really having them connect some kind of emotion to the topic, and that emotion can evoke feelings of change. And 8, the ethical obligation for persuasive speeches is even greater than in informative speeches, and that kind of ties into what I was just talking about. We don't want to be an irresponsible speaker and really just be unethical with things and playing on people's emotions in that way. So we do have a strong ethical obligation there, and of course, in persuasion speeches. And when we're asking people to change their attitudes, beliefs, values, courses of actions, whatever it might be on something, um, we have to be as credible as possible because we're asking people to make a change for us. And if we are not taking into consideration that ethical obligation there, then we're not being a responsible speaker. Now, persuasive reasoning methods. Many people consider an argument to be a war of words or even a verbal fight. By definition, though, an argument is intentional, it's purposeful speaking that involves sound reason and judgment. Well, a lot of times people do consider that argument to be a war of words, but a war of words is not necessarily calculated. So conflict might be, but not necessarily an argument. So we build a case or we create an argument to support our ideas, and that's what we're doing in persuasive speeches. Credibility is also a vital part of persuasive speaking. Credibility can be defined as the audience's perception of whether a speaker is qualified to speak on a given topic. Credibility is vital in any type of speech that we do, but especially persuasive speeches because, again, we're asking people to change something about themselves. Now, there are two factors that affect credibility: competence. And competence is how an audience regards a speaker's intelligence, expertise, and knowledge of the subject. And then there's character. And character is how an audience regards a speaker's sincerity, trustworthiness, and concern for the well-being of the audience. So those are two major factors that affect credibility: competence and character. Types of credibility. There are different types of credibility. Not only can a speaker's credibility vary from audience to audience and topic to topic, but also it can also change during the course of a speech. So credibility can change as the speech is actually taking place. So much so that we can identify three different types of credibility. First one is initial credibility, and that's going to be the credibility of a speaker before he or she starts to speak. Next, there's derived credibility, and that is the credibility of a speaker produced by everything he or she says and does during that speech. And then there's terminal credibility, and that's going to be the credibility of a speaker at the end of the speech. So you see we've got three different types of credibility. One occurs before, one occurs during, and one occurs after the speech, at the end of the speech. But how do you enhance your credibility? Well, first, you can explain your competence. And here's a good example of how you could explain your competence on a subject. Most of us have no idea what it means to be poor and hungry. But before returning to school last year, I spent 3 years working at a local assistance center. I can't tell you everything I've seen, but on the basis of what I can tell you, I hope you will agree with me that the government help for the poor and needy must be maintained. So that is how you would explain your competence. You talked about how you worked at a local assistance centers, so you have competence on this topic, and that is a really good thing for credibility. Okay, you can also enhance your credibility by establishing common ground with your audience, and that's going to be a technique in which a speaker connects himself or herself with the values, attitudes, or experiences of the audience. Let's say that you were trying to sell a product to an audience in Colorado. You might say something like this in your speech: I have never been in Colorado before, but I really looked forward to making this trip. A lot of my ancestors left Massachusetts and came to Colorado nearly 150 years ago. Sometimes I've wondered why they did it. They came in covered wagons carrying all their possessions, and many of them died on the journey. The ones who got through built their houses and raised their families. Now that I've seen Colorado, I understand why they tried so hard to get here. That would be a great way of establishing common ground with your audience because they're from Colorado. Next, you can enhance your credibility by delivering your speeches fluently, expressively, and with conviction. Again, this ties into just practice, practice, practice. So to develop evidence, you want to, to really make your persuasion speech more credible, you want to include evidence. And evidence is supporting material such as examples, statistics, testimony, and so forth. used to prove or disprove something. Facts and figures are often the ultimate justification for asking someone to change their beliefs or things such as that. Facts and figures can go a long way. Examples, though, can awaken feelings that make listeners want to act and can help bring factual situations into a better focus. Examples can be wonderful as well. Narratives can carry listeners to the scene of a problem and make them witness to a living drama. So narratives, when we use vivid language, especially narratives, they can help really put a real world spin on things. So that's another great form of evidence in persuasive speaking. And when you use testimony in persuasive speeches, you call on experts as witnesses to support your position. So testimony could be another great thing to add in there as well. Now, there are three things, though, that you do want to work to include in your persuasive speeches. And that's going to be the use of ethos, logos, and pathos to support an argument. Logos refers to verbal arguments you make relating to your subject. This also can be described as arguments from the words of the speech itself. Now, let me try to break this down a lot better. Logos is basically just using logic to support your claim. Facts and statistics are a great example of how we can include logos in our persuasive speeches. Here's an example. We do not have enough money to pay for improvements to our railroads, and without improvements, this transportation system will falter and thus hinder our economy. Therefore, we should raise taxes to pay for better railroads. That's just using facts and statistics, well, mainly facts here. That's using facts to that's using facts as logos to really support your claim. Okay, so logic is a good way to strengthen a persuasive speech. Pathos is appeals or reasons directed towards an audience's emotion. So you want to try to include pathos as well in a responsible manner. So sometimes people appeal to negative emotions, fear, anger, guilt. All those things motivate us. If you were, let's say, doing a persuasive speech on why someone should know the basics of first aid, you might tell a narrative at the beginning that basically describes how what if you were in a situation in which one of your family members needed first aid and you didn't know how to execute it properly? What if because of that something really bad happened? Of course, you'd actually paint a narrative there, but that is fear. It's not irresponsible because you would say, this is a hypothetical example, but what if this happened? It's using fear to motivate someone to learn that skill, first aid. Appeals to needs. A lot of times pathos appeals to some form of a need. Basic needs, security and safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization. Those are all things that ways to which you can include pathos in your speech as well. Just be responsible with it. But we see this a lot with the SPCA commercials on TV. They're using pathos to persuade you to donate to that organization. And then ethos. Ethos is another great way to really strengthen your persuasive speech. And ethos is when we use personal credibility or character traits that make a speaker believable and worthy of the audience's confidence. Now, when we use ethos, we're using experts to strengthen our claim. So you might talk about how if you were doing a medical speech, you might want to quote the Center for Disease Control, or you might want to quote medical professionals. Those would be examples of experts in the field. So again, remember, you need to use ethos, logos, and pathos to really support your claim. It just makes it more persuasive as a whole. And also keep in mind that some people are going to believe experts more. Some people are going to need more logic, and some people are just going to need more emotional appeals. So that's why we include all three, because you just don't know who in your audience is going to focus more on what, ethos, logos, or pathos. Okay, now I want to talk about fallacies, though. And a fallacy is an error in reasoning. As a speaker, you need to work to avoid fallacies in your speeches. As a listener, though, you want to be alert to fallacies in speeches that you hear. Now, the first one I want to talk about is hasty generalization. And that's going to be a fallacy in which a speaker jumps to a general conclusion on the basis of insufficient evidence. An example of that would be, Throughout American history, military leaders have always made excellent presidents. Look at the examples of George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Dwight Eisenhower. Well, that's a fallacy. It's a hasty generalization. It's a fallacy in which we as the speaker jump to a general conclusion on the basis of insufficient evidence. Another one would be false cause. False cause is a fallacy in which a speaker mistakenly assumes that because one event follows another, the first event is the cause of the second event. Here's an example. When a team from the NFC wins the Super Bowl, economic growth during the next year is stronger than when a team from the AFC wins the Super Bowl. Therefore, if we want economic growth, we should root for a team from the NFC to win this year's Super Bowl. Well, that's just say because one thing happened, it's causing economic growth. Well, of course, we know that that's not logical to think that, so that would be false cause. Next example of a fallacy would be invalid analogy. And that's an analogy in which the two cases being compared are not essentially alike. Here's a good example. In Great Britain, the general election campaign for Prime Minister lasts less than 3 weeks. Surely we can do the same in the United States presidential election. Well, we're trying to use an analogy there, but the two cases being compared aren't alike, so you can't really compare them. That's going to be an invalid analogy. Next example is going to be bandwagon, and that's a fallacy which assumes that because something is popular, it is therefore good, correct, or desirable. Here's an example. The governor must be correct in his approach to social policy. After all, the polls show that 60% of the people support him. Well, that's assuming that just because, 60% of people support him, that his approach is good, correct, and desirable. That's not logical to think that way. Red herring is a different type of fallacy, and that's going to be a fallacy that introduces an irrelevant issue to divert attention from the subject under discussion. An example of this might be, how dare my opponents accuse me of political corruption at a time when we are working to improve the quality of life for all people in the United States? Well, that is introducing an irrelevant issue. They're working to improve the quality of life to divert our attention away from the subject under discussion, political corruption. Another type of fallacy would be ad hominem, and that's a fallacy that attacks a person rather than dealing with the real issue in dispute. Here's an example. The head of the Commerce Commission has a number of interesting economic proposals, but let's not forget that she comes from a very wealthy family. Well, that person is attacking, that statement is attacking the person rather than dealing with the real issue, which is economic proposals. Either or is a different type of fallacy, and that's going to be a fallacy that forces listeners to choose between two alternatives when more than two alternatives exist. Here's an example. The government must either raise taxes or eliminate services for the poor. It's either or there. It forces the listener to choose between two things, but there are actually more than two things we could do there, so it's not logical. And then there's slippery slope, and that's a fallacy which assumes that taking a first step will lead to subsequent steps that cannot be prevented. Let's look at an example. Now that the TSA is allowed to use full body scanners and invasive pat-downs before letting us through security, it's only a matter of time before they strip search every man, woman, and child who wants to fly on a plane. That's saying that just because they're doing one thing, that it's going to lead to these subsequent steps that can't be prevented. Well, we know that's not logical either. Appeal to tradition. That's going to be a fallacy which assumes that something old is automatically better than something new. Here's an example. I don't see any reason to abolish the Electoral College. It's been around since the adoption of the United States Constitution in 1787, and we should keep it as long as the United States continues to exist. It's saying that because it's old, we need to keep it, because it's better than something that could be new. And in the reverse, there is appeal to novelty, which is a fallacy that assumes that something new is automatically better than something old. Here's an example. Our church should adopt the 2011 New International Version of the Bible because it is 400 years newer than the King James Version. It's saying just because it's newer that it's better. Well, we know that's not logical either. So with that being said, that wraps up our lesson 5 lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed the material and learned a great deal. If you do have any questions, you can always contact me via email in the course. Otherwise, go ahead and get started with your lesson 5 assignments and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much and have a great week.